11 o'clock. Come join us. It's 11 o'clock. Come have a seat and we'll get our service started. Good morning, everybody. My name is Charlotte Olson, and I'm a member of this congregation, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Chattanooga. I'd like to welcome all of you here with us this morning. For those of you with us in person, it's nice to see you. And for those of you who are joining us virtually, although I cannot see you, we know you're with us, and we're glad you are. Our minister, the Reverend Mandy Goheen, is not in the pulpit today, but if you'd like to meet with her, she is readily available by email or by phone. You can just contact the office. Her next Sunday, actually up here, will be August 21st. And in the meantime, we have a wonderful lineup of special guest speakers for the next few weeks of our Sunday services. So again, hello, welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Good morning. My name's Talia Welsh, and I've been a member here for a number of years. Every week is a new thing, so if you're new, I hope you come back at least a couple more times to get a feel for this wonderful congregation. So I'm a deeply secular person, and so I find myself often surprised to be in a church, but how wonderful to be in a church where I can come speak about Hannah Arendt and hear people before the service talk about the problems of capitalism. So rare church, I'd say, indeed. So I'm going to speak today about the thinker Hannah Arendt, and the reading I have for the opening words is from her book, The Human Condition. If left to themselves, human affairs can only follow the law of mortality, which is the most certain and the only reliable law of a life spent between birth and death. It is the faculty of action that interferes with this law because it interrupts the inexorable automatic course of daily life, which in its turn, as we saw, interrupted and interfered with the cycle of the biological life process. The lifespan of man running towards death would inevitably carry everything human to ruin and destruction if it were not for the faculty of interrupting it and beginning something new, a faculty which is inherent in action, like an ever-present reminder that men, though they must die, are not born in order to die, but in order to begin. Yet just as, from the standpoint of nature, the rectilinear movement of man's lifespan between birth and death looks like a peculiar deviation from the common natural rule of cyclical movement, thus action, seen from the viewpoint of automatic processes, which seems to determine the cause of the world, looks like a miracle. The miracle that saves the world, the realm of human affairs, from its normal natural ruin, is ultimately the fact of natality, in which the faculty of action is rooted. It is, in other words, the birth of new men and the new beginning, the action and thought by which they're capable of being born. Only the full experience of this capacity can bestow upon human affairs faith and hope, those two essential characteristics of human existence, which Greek antiquity ignored, discounting the keeping of faith as a very uncommon and not too important virtue, and counting hope among the evils of illusion in Pandora's box. It is this faith in and hope for the world that found perhaps its most glorious and most succinct expression in the few words with which the gospel announced its glad tidings: a child has been born unto us.
And now it's time to light our chalice, the chalice being the symbol of our faith, Unitarian Universalism. So I would like to invite Talia and her husband, John Littlefield, and her son, David Littlefield, to come up now to light our chalice. It's a family affair. And as they do so, let's read the chalice lighting words, which you will find in your order of service. In the light of truth, in the warmth of love, we gather to seek, to sustain, and to share. Thank you. And now we get to sing. The song is number 300 in your hymnal, With Heart and Mind. And while you're looking for that song, I would like to introduce our musical guest for today, Benjamin Brown. Benjamin's been with us before. You may recognize him. He is the very talented student of our music director, Dr. Jennifer Arbogast Wilson, who's off today. So we've been fortunate to have Benjamin in the past. We're so happy to have him back today. Now, please rise as you wish and are able, and let's sing With Heart and Mind. And now it's time for all ages.
So this is a story called The Three Questions by Leo Tolstoy. It once occurred to a certain king that if he always knew the right time to begin everything, if he knew who were the right people to listen to and whom to avoid, and above all, if he always knew what was the most important thing to do, he would never fail in anything he might undertake. And this thought having occurred to him, he had it proclaimed throughout his kingdom that he would give a great reward to anyone who could teach him what was the right time for every action, and who were the most necessary people, and how he might know what was the most important thing to do. And learned men came to the king, but they all answered his questions differently. In reply to the first question, some said that to know the right time for every action, one must draw up a table of days and months. Some said that it's impossible to decide, and you should not be absorbed in such a thing. And others said that the king should always know what's going on and do what he understood to be right. So the king was frustrated by all of these different advices. And so he decided that what he needed to do was to consult a hermit. The hermit lived in a wood which he never quitted, and he received none but common folk. So the king put on simple clothes, and before reaching the hermit's cell, dismounted from his horse. Leaving his bodyguard behind, he went on alone. When the king approached, the hermit was digging in the ground in front of the hut. Seeing the king, he greeted him and went on digging. The hermit was frail and weak, and each time he struck his spade into the ground and turned a little earth, he breathed heavily. The king went up to him and said, "I have come to you, wise hermit, to ask you the answer to these three questions. How can I learn to do the right thing at the right time? Who are the people I most need? And to whom should I therefore pay most attention than to the rest? And what affairs are the most important and need my first attention?" The hermit listened to the king, but answered nothing. He just spat on his hand and recommenced digging. "You are tired," said the king. "Let me take the spade and work for a while with you." "Thanks," said the hermit, and giving the spade to the king, he sat down on the ground. When he had dug 2 beds, the king stopped and repeated his questions. The hermit again gave no answer, but rose, stretched his hand for the spade, and said, "Now rest a while, and let me work a bit." But the king did not give him the spade and continued to dig. 1 hour passed, then another. The sun began to sink behind the trees, and the king at last struck the spade into the ground and said, "I came to you, wise man, for answers to my questions. If you can give me none, tell me so, and I will return home." "Here comes someone running," said the hermit. "Let us see who it is." The king turned around and saw a bearded man coming out running from the wood. The man held his hands pressed against his stomach. He was badly wounded, with blood coming from underneath his hands. When he reached the king, he fell fainting on the ground, moaning. The king unfastened his clothes, cleaned his wound, and he and the hermit carried him into the cottage to help him get better. Right before the man fell asleep, he looked at the king and he said, "Forgive me. I know you not, and I have nothing to forgive you for," said the king. "You do not know me, but I know you. I am the enemy of yours who swore to revenge himself on you, because you executed my brother and seized his property. I knew you had gone to see the hermit, and I resolved to kill you on your way back, but the day passed and you did not return. So when I came out to ambush you, your bodyguard caught you. If you had not come and helped me, and you had not saved my life, I would not be here today. So please forgive me for my attempt to hurt you." The king was very glad to have made peace with his enemy so easily, and having gained for him a friend. And he not only forgave him, but said he would send his servants to take care of him. Having taken leave of the wounded man, the king went out into the porch and looked around for the hermit. But before going away, he wished once more to beg for an answer to the questions he had put. The hermit was outside, on his knees, sowing seeds into the bed that had been dug the day before. The king said, "For the last time, I pray to you to answer my questions, wise man." "You have already been answered," said the hermit, still crouching on his thin legs, looking up at the king. "How answered? What do you mean?" "Do you not see," replied the hermit, "if you had not pitied my weakness yesterday, and had not dug those beds for me, but had gone your way, that man would have attacked you, and you would not have been able to stay with me. So the most important time was when you're digging the beds, and I was the most important man, and to do good for me was your most important business. Afterwards, when that man ran to us, the most important thing was for helping him. If you'd not bound up his wounds, he would have died. So he was the most important man, and what you did for him was your most important business. Remember then, there's only one time that is important now. It is the most important time because the only time when we have any power. The most necessary person is the one with whom you are with, For no man knows whether he will ever have dealings with anyone else. And the most important affair is to do that person good, because for that purpose alone, man was sent into this life. So thank you for listening to this story. And now is the time for us to sing the children out and on their way down to RE.
Let's take a few moments now to slow down, focus our thoughts, even focus our breathing. I invite you to sit comfortably, place your feet solidly on the floor, and close your eyes if you wish. I'll chime the singing bowl, and as we listen to the sound reverberate and then fade away, we'll have a moment or two of silence. After that, I'll come down with the lighter. Anyone who would like to light a candle to represent a joy or a concern is invited to come forward at that time. For those of you joining us on YouTube, we know that you too may have a joy or a concern you'd like to share with this beloved community. So at the end, I'll light 2 additional candles, one for any joys and one for any concerns that remain on our hearts. I'll now chime the singing bowl. It's now time for our offertory. If you are visiting with us, please let the plate pass you by. Your presence here with us this morning is gift enough. Thank you for your support. And let's read together our offertory response as found in your order of service. We give these gifts freely, committed to our mission to care, community, awaken hearts and minds, resist injustice and act with compassion, embrace life and care for the earth. To this work, we dedicate our offerings. And I'm so sorry, I skipped ahead in our order of service here. Thanks to the ushers for being so flexible. And now, what you've all been waiting for, Talia Welsh.
So one of the great joys of getting older is I forgot my reading glasses. So I think I'm going to be able to make this work. So anyhow, it's a real delight to be able to speak about Hannah Arendt. She's a thinker that's near and dear to my heart, and somebody who's been talked about a lot lately in the last 5 or 6 years as being pretty prescient about some of the things that are going on in our world. So hopefully this will be interesting for those of you who know a little bit about Hannah Arendt, and interesting for those who are unfamiliar with her. Hannah Arendt is impossible to easily classify as a thinker. She's not a conservative, a liberal, a progressive, a socialist, a communist, or any other group that is common to affiliate a political thinker's thought with. While a staunch defender of stateless people and a clear supporter of equal rights, she did not take up social issues in the manner that many of us do today, such as feminism, anti-racism, or reconsiderations of the lives of famous people, such as Thomas Jefferson, to whom she was very indebted. I do not think this is because she died in 1975, but rather because she had a clear and very unambiguous interest in a certain unique view of politics that exceeds both social definitions of one's place in society, as well as one's current government, party, or affiliation. She was born in 1906 in Königsberg, the birthplace of the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, to whom she often discussed with her in her studies and in her work, to a secular German Jewish family. She was an outstanding student, and she wrote her PhD thesis on St. Augustine with Karl Jaspers. And she worked with many other famous philosophers, such as Martin Heidegger and Edmund Husserl, and other theologians at the time. As the Nazis rose to power, Arendt was arrested due to her work helping Zionist friends research anti-Semitic propaganda in 1933. In a twist of very good fortune in a time of little good fortune, and to some degree to her own capacity to fool the guards, she was released without exposing the work and was able to flee. She was stateless for 18 years, and after which she finally became an American citizen. Her work on stateless people is some of her most trenchant. And as with other parts of her work, it's become even more relevant in our world where there are currently approximately 12 million stateless people. In America, she lectured at a number of US universities, Princeton, Stanford, and she was quite sort of famous in her time. But she was most closely tied to the New School for Social Research in New York. So some of her major works include The Origins of Totalitarianism, The Human Condition. I read the opening words was from that book, Between Past and Future, and Men in Dark Times. The work she became most broadly famous for, so beyond more academic circles, is her work documenting the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem for the New Yorker magazine, which was published in segments in the magazine and then later as a book entitled Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. In a late interview speaking about the Eichmann trial, Arendt said dryly that she actually occasionally would laugh during the long trial at Eichmann to help explain her ideas of why this trial brought to mind her concept of the banality of evil. Eichmann was an unpromising student who eventually rose to a position of prominence in the Nazi Party, performing the organization, sort of more the bureaucratic work of the final solution, so organizing trains, supplies, gas, and other ways in which to exterminate millions of people. He fled, one of the sort of more senior people was able to sort of flee prosecution immediately and capture, and eventually he ended up in Argentina after the war. And in quite a dramatic story, which is well worth reading more about, the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, the Mossad, sort of found him, captured him, drugged him, got him on a plane, and flew him back to Israel, all sort of secretly because Argentina had no extradition treaty with Israel. And so he was in Israel to stand trial. And after the trial, he was hung in 1962. So Arendt attended this trial for the New Yorker, but she also had sort of wide access to the different interviews by the prosecution and by his defense attorneys. So she had a sort of mountain of material that she used to write her reports. Arendt drew attention to a few characteristics of Eichmann's defense. So first was a focus on his own career. So he famously said, well, I was just following orders as a defense for what he did. But interestingly, what she also talked about was he would acknowledge that his acts contributed to the deaths of countless people. And he didn't sort of suggest it didn't happen or it wasn't as bad as it was. But what he wanted to speak the most about was some minor slight by some official who was above him or below him, or there was some meeting where he didn't get the promotion. So he seemed, in her mind, sort of unable to think about what had happened, unable to sort of recognize the import or the perspective of what he was being tried for. And the second was this bumbling way of speaking in cliches and repetitive phrases. And for Arendt, this was sort of emblematic of that Eichmann refused to think, and this refusal was connected to the crimes for which he was guilty. Thinking for Arendt is a conversation one has with oneself and was necessary in order to think with others. Eichmann was unable to have any discussion about himself, apparently other than a linear just the facts, like he was sort of an empty head pointed towards the world. For Arendt, the horrors of the Holocaust, the gulags, the endless refugee camps was due not to a set of evil figures bent on twisting the world to their own whims, but to the non-thinking, non-acting public, a kind of thoughtlessness about oneself and others. I should note, and this is that whether or not Arendt was accurate about Eichmann, like whether or not he really was this sort of foolish, bureaucratic man, is as far as I understand, quite debatable, that she might not have actually captured him correctly. But I still think, nonetheless, this kind of resilience of the concept of the banality of evil exceeds whether or not she was correct about Eichmann historically. So I think that the lasting appeal of the banality of evil is our understanding of how so many horrors grow through thoughtlessness, indifference, lack of self-awareness, importantly, a collapse of connection to others in the world. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt wrote that what distinguished totalitarian regimes from other kinds of brutal, oppressive regimes is a certain relationship to truth and to its victims. And so she singled out in the Origins of Totalitarianism two regimes, the Nazi regime and then Stalin's regime in Russia. Totalitarian regimes made special effort not to lie per se, but to reduce the capacity for anyone to know what is a lie and what was truth. Everything becomes relative, shifting, and uncertain. Recent writers have noted Arendt's foresight into our own age with our social media infotainment-infused landscape, where well-founded research and quality reporting have lost their status in a flood of unsubstantiated claims. For Arendt, this ungrounding of truth encourages banal, stupid thinking, where there's indeed no point to thinking, as there's nothing sure to be thought. History is, of course, full of tyrannical kings, warlords, and emperors who wield their power without concern for the average person. Arendt differed from other political thinkers in suggesting that Stalin and Hitler represented something different, not a continuation of the desire for power and domination. A king's decrees, cruel or benevolent, can be rejected. And indeed, one of the great many reasons to reject the king, or at least reject him in spirit or in thought, even if you don't have the power in action, is because of the cruelty of them. But totalitarian regimes differ in a shifting set of decrees and rules, all contradictory, none clear. While it might have a head, its system of dismantling these shifting falsehoods, disseminating these shifting falsehoods, is more critical, than a head of state. The falsehoods encourage the destruction not just of thinking, but of traditional forms of authority, such as order and community, as now anyone, even one's friend or sister, can be tomorrow found guilty of a crime that yesterday did not exist. And indeed, the turn to populism itself is often born out of the conviction that everything political is dirty, wrong, and essentially corrupt, which for Arendt is actually a real problem because it's fostered by this lack of truth that totalitarian regimes produce and this kind of shifting nature of nothing being certain or stable. It's true that and a desire to wipe out the slate clean and not do politics is for Arendt a closure of real thinking. It is true that to think, one must think with oneself, so you have to ask your own views and question yourself and doubt yourself. But for Arendt, all thinking is political, and what she means by political is not what we typically would think about political. So political, for her, is people that come together in a community and discuss issues of social import. And so in that sense, when you're thinking, you're always thinking with others. So of course you think by yourself, but the thinking is always directed towards other people. Arendt noted another feature of totalitarianism that differed from other unjust regimes is that its victims must be maximally innocent and will paradoxically enough become guilty by this very innocence. So if you have a war between two forces, or multiple forces, I suppose, both sides can be seen as having a perspective. A criminal is a person who did things for a reason, whether good or bad. A state and a community can rightly regard the criminal or the intruding force as being real threats. This makes the focus in totalitarian regimes on groups of people like religious minorities, LGBTQ+ persons, stateless people, and racial minorities not traditionally understandable in typical notions of domination and tyranny. Why focus on groups that present no real immediate threat, that have no real chance of taking over, of getting power, or of changing the system? Indeed, often these victims are extremely vulnerable and barely surviving. So this for Arendt was really sort of striking about what Stalin and Hitler engaged in, was an attack on very innocent people, and people who didn't actually present any threat to the regime. Arendt noted that the genius in this is that the innocent become faceless and malleable to shifting, truthless propaganda of the regime. If things are done to them, if they're gassed or killed at the border or shot in the streets while jogging, they must have done something she thinks is what becomes the reasonable person's view, because why would such a horror happen to them? Since they have little power to speak their voices, no real counter to this view is given, and they become monstrous boogeymen capable of wild conspiratorial actions like poisoning children, taking over the banking system, or our current conspiracy of replacement theory. If you target a group with some power, with a face and a name and a culture, you cannot reduce them to anything at all. But if the enemy is completely innocent, they can become anything at all, because it goes beyond normal intuition to think that something so horrible could happen to those who have done nothing. For Arendt, the problem was, and I would say just our problem today as well, is how to protect against totalitarianism, both in its larger form, so in these like historical regimes, and potentially current governments, but also in its smaller but just as problematic current forms. For her, we live in a world without true authority anymore because we have a world of what she calls mass culture and have lost our traditions. Now, of course, in this community, we often talk about the importance of losing traditions and finding new traditions and not doing things the way we did them before. And so she of course agrees with that, but she also thinks that authority is actually very important for certain kinds of things. And so the examples I've often thought about is you could see the kind of shift away from taking just the authority of medical professionals for granted, or taking the authority of teachers and librarians for granted, that these are experts and they, by and large, know what they're doing. And so, for her, that if you live in this world without that kind of authority, people are very prone to influence. So authority for all its sins also grounds us to respect things we do not fully understand, sometimes for our own good. For Arendt, it's what she calls action, very different from other views of action, that saves us in a world of populism, totalitarianism, and a lack of stable authority. For her, action is importantly not work or labor. Work or labor are part of the endless cyclical nature of humans, like bees or beavers, to do things in the world to survive. And she's not dismissive of that, but she sees the uniqueness of humans being this action. They're given to us as burdens that we have to engage in as our expulsion from the Garden of Eden. So action is the beginning of something new. Its basis comes from the advent of birth, both of humans as biological beings, but the birth of new thought. Many theorists at this time, and I think still today, discuss this kind of queer position that we're in where we know we're going to die as humans, and how maybe that marks us as different than other beings. This makes our life one of finitude and where we create different worlds to avoid death. But Arendt said that the real miracle of humans is not that we die like other living creatures, but that we begin new things that had not existed before. And Arendt uses this concept of birth fairly philosophically. She was not interested in the particularities of birth per se, but rather the birth as a birth of a new story, the birth of a new person whose new world we cannot know in advance. This might make, for instance, us think about the products of work, like a new computer program or wind turbines, as action. But for Arendt, the important criteria for action is not that it produces a thing that is needed. So for her, work is something that you need a thing and you go out and produce it in the world. Maybe more creatively or maybe better than it was before. For her, action is when you do something that was not there before or think something that had not been thought before. And for her, she thinks that what we've lost in contemporary political life is this capacity for action, that all politics has become a handmaiden to the economy. And I thought at the end of the talk earlier today, if you were here, there's sort of this call to sort of looking at the whole kind of economic system as part of the problem of affordable, safe, and sustainable food. And Arendt would be very sympathetic to that she thinks that what's happened now in politics is all we do is serve a pre-existing system and don't think outside of that. We often see how the talking points of politicians are about how to solve economic problems. Well, of course, these are problems that need to be solved. So I'm not saying that she doesn't think we should just throw up our hands and not do any of this stuff anymore. But she would ask more importantly, how can one expand one's imagination, not just to solutions of pre-existing problems, but different ways to think about politics altogether. So we live in a world of the closure of the political imaginary. We have a left, we have a right, and for her, this is largely due to the failure of communism in the West, and so there's sort of not this viable other alternative that people would adhere to, but for her, this means we have to think something new. So she was also critical of party politics, since platforms and rising to prominence within them was not about proposing new ideas, but rather obedience to the party elders. Real politics would be instead the place not where opinions vie for dominance or where one promotes the party, but where we envision a politics as a place wherein we create a space for the birth of new ideas to come to the fore. So thank you so much for listening to me talk about Hannah Arendt. I hope that wasn't too Professor E. So if it was,
And now we get to sing together once again. So our closing song is number 1, May Nothing Evil Cross This Door. Should be easy to find in the hymnal. And let's stand as you wish and are able, and let's sing. I would now like to invite John and Talia to extinguish our chalice. David has gone downstairs. But as they extinguish the chalice, let's read the words found in your order of service. We extinguish this flame, keep the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the light of commitment. These we carry in our hearts and share with all the world. Okay, Talia, so what?
There's a contemporary theorist and activist in critical disability studies, Rosemary Garland Thompson, and she's written a lot about the value of misfitting in this world where we're really encouraged to fit. And she noted that one of the many things that's happening in countries around the world, such as Denmark, that has initiated prenatal testing is a sort of erasure of certain kinds of people. And she's not against prenatal testing, and she's not against, not certainly into telling people what they should do, but she did say that it sort of assumes that we only know what kind of lives are lives worth living. And I think that what Hannah Arendt encourages us with these ideas of birth and action is to really think about the possibility of what new beings could come into the world, what they could have to offer, and not to make so many assumptions about what a good life is. I would say one of the things that, I definitely think her thoughts of banality of evil and the concern of totalitarianism ring very true today, but I also really like her work where we try to think against work as being what makes a life worth living. That in order to be a person of value and a person that could bring new into the world, you have to have a productive career. And I think thinking more outside of that kind of narrow vision of a life worth living in politics would be beneficial for us. So I think that, just my last sort of thoughts here, Arendt did not see love or affection as a basis for politics, as a community of persons who must respect the possibility of the new in others. Instead, the political is the place to imagine the larger community, to accept the possibility of others, not an affection for who they are, but rather who they might become or what they might offer. This allows us to have a politics where we point towards the new, the not yet, and a place in which we can affirm the value of others, but imagine how we can create worlds that do not exist at this current moment.
We now are going to take just a couple of moments for any announcements. If you have an announcement, come on up. We're going to share the mic. I've got a few too. We're going to use this mic.
That makes it easier. I'm a little bit behind, and this announcement will be coming out in electronic form sometime soon, but I wanted to start the RSVPs for my ordination, which is to be scheduled for Saturday, August 20th at 2 in the afternoon. We need some numbers for planning for food and the like, so if you're going to attend, feel free to sign up now, or if not, you'll have another way to be able to sign up later. Thank you.
That's such an honor for us to be witness to Pam's ordination. Okay, here are some announcements from the office. Reverend Mandy is out of the office until August 1st, and the office will be closed all this coming week and reopen on Monday, July 25th. But the good news is you may continue to send in pledges while the office is closed. There will be no newsletter this week, but an email will go out on Thursday about next Sunday's speaker, a week from today, who is Tom Kunish in his Land Acknowledgement series. No membership, okay, that's announcement number 2. No membership 101 today while Reverend Mandy is out of town. The next membership 101 will be on Sunday, August 21st. Which is when she's back in the pulpit, the date I mentioned earlier. I have another announcement, which is actually a bit of a plug. Today's service was organized by a committee called the Wowzers, and the WOW in Wowzers stands for Working on Worship. The Wowzers plan any services that are not led by Reverend Mandy. Generally, those are the 4th Sundays of the month and the occasional 5th Sunday. Obviously, our summer schedule is a little bit different, so we're doing a few more for the next 6 weeks or so, and that's why we've come up with this exciting lineup of wonderful speakers, including Talia. Wowzers would just love to have more members. If you are at all interested, I would love to talk with you after today's service. We have a few other Wowzers sitting out here. Dadey is on the committee, and Steve and Pam, thank you for raising your hands. We have a former Wowzer who's hiding in the corner. Thank you. Andy can talk about a lot of stuff, not just Wowzers. If you are joining us virtually, you too can be a Wowzer. Contact the office and Farron will put you in touch with us. Are there any other announcements?
I swear I'm going to try to keep it fast today. Okay, so this coming Wednesday is our I think it's the 3rd Wednesday of the month. Sorry. Talia really has got me thinking about a lot of things. The last time we met, we talked about the recent Supreme Court decisions. And so the question that comes up in my mind is, what are we sliding toward or back to? So in that sense, that's what we're going to talk about on Wednesday at 10 o'clock. If you can be here, it's a fabulous gathering of people. We eat, drink, and discuss things in a heated manner sometimes. Also, Wednesday, 10 to 12 o'clock. That's the first one. Second one, there were 13 people who came out to ride bikes yesterday. Raise your hand if you were one of them. Yes, and you see, none of them were limping in or anything like that. It worked out just fine. And I'm sorry, I'm doing Christian's announcement for him. He's organized a summer night series. I think that's what he's called it. Yesterday was the first one. The next one is on the 30th, and we're all going to go see a baseball game together. So just make sure that you keep yourselves aware of that. It's going to be a special evening because I think it's going to be the mascot evening where they do all kinds of special performances and all of that. The third and last thing is thank you everybody who came this morning to our adult education series. We heard from two fabulous speakers who are still here, as a matter of fact. They're experiencing Unitarian Universalism, so throw the love at them if you would. Melanie Lusk from Crabtree Farm spoke to us, and Jess Wilson from the Southeast Tennessee Young Farmers Coalition. We learned a lot, generated a lot of questions, and it's made it so we have a lot to think about access to food, access to land, and what's going on in a changing world. So feel free to talk to one of them or talk to me afterward if you need more information. You can send me an email if you want more information about it. Anyway, next week, we're continuing our series. We have a representative from the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, who's going to talk to us about how to hold the government and agencies accountable for environmental policy and ways that we can participate in that. It's not going to be at 9:30. It's going to be at 1 o'clock next week. 1 o'clock. So, Dady, you can be there. Yes, Steve, you can wake up in time for that. Yes, it's good. So 1 o'clock, there will be a light lunch. I know that we're going to have deviled eggs and some sandwiches there, but if you want to participate in bringing food for a light finger foods type lunch between the service and the 1 o'clock study series, please let me know. And I think that's all. Thanks.
Are there any other announcements? Great, wonderful, thank you. Have a lovely week, everyone.
Thank you.